Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with our good friend, Professor Richard Conder, and we're going to discuss the death of rock and roll. Richard, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Tony.
It's
Now,
been,
I would say on my screen, I don't seem to be there. You can see me okay, can you?
I can see you fine. Yes, you're looking as
Fine.
wonderful as ever. And yeah, and of course, Richard and I used to do a few on the radio, didn't we? Where we'd
We
actually
did.
play tracks and everything else. But you
Yeah.
know, Tony at 12 hasn't got that technical ability, so we have to just do it by word of mouth. But there we are. So
Right.
looking at
Okay.
rock and roll, it all happens in 1955, I reckon, about 70 years ago.
Yeah, I think I'd agree that was around about the time Bill Haley and Elvis Presley with "That's All Right, Mama,"
Mm.
and before that, you'd had jazz and blues, country, big bands. But it was a seismic change in '55, I think, with Rock Around the Clock and Elvis Presley
Yeah.
just starting to appear.
Well, we'll look at the various people that were responsible for it in a minute. But of course, Alan Freed, who seemed to get his nose into everything in the United States as far as the music business was
Yeah,
concerned, he invented it, apparently, the name rock and roll,
yeah,
because he wanted to avoid the racial stigma of rhythm and blues.
yeah. That
Now
that's
interesting. Yeah.
I think that was part of it. You're right about Alan Freed. He got his nose into everything, including writing credits for Chuck Berry's "Sweet Little 16," which was
Absolutely.
complete nonsense.
Yes. Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
got some
Yeah.
nice royalties out of that. But that's another story. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that was the reason in '55. But rhythm and blues was the generic term used in the '60s, when we're going to talk about it later on, when the Liverpool beat boom came, and the British rock and roll groups appeared
Yeah.
around
Rolling
62,
Stones in
and they
particular.
called it rhythm and blues then.
Yeah, yeah,
Sorry,
yeah,
Tony.
yeah. So I mean, it's a sort of crazy way in which these things sort of switch from
Yeah,
one side to the other and everything around
yeah,
that. But looking back, and you're a bit younger than me, so you won't remember it. But I do remember "Rock Around the Clock," Bill Haley, um,
yeah.
and at the time it was an anthem for rebellious teens, wasn't it?
Yes, and of course, it's really interesting that, because anybody less like a rebel in appearance, and I think demeanour, you couldn't really find in old Bill Haley, with his kissed curl and a bit overweight,
Yep.
and well past the halcyon days of his 20s, I suspect, in '55. But yeah, I mean, came over here, and there are well-known films or videos now showing German fans in particular ripping up seats and climbing on stage and all that sort of stuff that was associated with rebellious teenagers and in particular teddy boys and people like that. So very interesting, because I guess young people coming out. I mean, after all, 1955 was only 10 years after the end of the war,
Yeah.
and austerity was just starting, particularly in the UK. It hadn't really existed in America, but in the UK, people were starting to have more money in their pockets. Young people were starting to feel greater freedom. And in fairness to the generation before, they were very anxious to make sure that young people had the life they couldn't have in the war,
Yeah.
or in the
Yeah.
'30s and the Depression.
And
Um, and I think what in my reading of it and understanding of it, I mean, the rock and roll was based on basically what they called the 12 bar blues,
mm,
which was 12 chords played. What, for technical terms, it's called one, and then chord 4, and then chord 5, which in the scale is, if you take A, it's A, D, and E.
mm,
And I mean, that underpins all rock and roll, and of course that was the core of blues music.
mm.
Um, and so rock and roll really came out of blues music and country music.
Yeah.
Country music, what it was, it didn't have the defined rhythmic pattern that rock and roll blues did, and then rock and roll did. You won't hear many rock and roll tunes that haven't got the 12 bar blues sequence underneath them,
Mm.
or what Chuck Berry would probably call a backbeat. And although people probably aren't aware of it, there is something about that chord progression that makes people want to dance and makes people want to tap their feet. It seems to be a natural rhythm. And blues music is often described as the only original music to come out of the United States, because it didn't come over from Africa with the slave trade. It was actually developed mostly by black slaves, and then people who were suffering enormous deprivation and prejudice developed their own music. So that flowed into the mainstream through white rock and rollers like Bill Haley and Elvis Presley.
Yeah, let's just recalling Bill Haley. I remember, he did a tour of England, as you've said, and he came over by boat.
Yes.
And
met at Southampton docks.
Yeah, and there's some film of him actually on the boat train going up to Waterloo. It's incredible,
there is indeed.
isn't it?
I've seen that.
So I wonder how many days it took. 6 days to get across, something crazy.
5 or 6 days, isn't it, at least, to come across? Really quite extraordinary. And Rock Around the Clock hit the charts 2 or 3 times over the next 70 years. And it certainly did again in the 60s, and I think in the same, usually associated with the film or something like that.
Yeah.
But it is still a totemic tune, and it still has freshness even now, which, he really almost was a one-hit man. He did See You Later, Alligator after that, and I think probably Shake, Rattle and Roll. But he really was. That was what made him and what he was really known for. And not a lot came out of the Bill Haley and the Comets after that.
And he was a bit too early for this plan whereby you digress your music as you go along.
Yes.
I think Buddy Holly came along a couple of years later. He was able to do that. But in the main, Bill Haley, as you say, just had one format, and that's really how he went from there. Let's move on to Elvis, because he's obviously a very important player in rock and roll. Some people say he's the king of rock and roll. I don't necessarily agree with that one, and I know you don't agree with that one. But it's strange, isn't it? A sort of visit to Sam Phillips at the recording studio, pay for an acetate to be made, and Bob's your uncle. Yeah,
it was. He was very fortunate as mind. One, he was extremely good-looking young man, and two, he did have a very good voice.
Yeah.
And of course, he hit the tide just at the right time. And unlike Bill Haley, he was young.
Yeah.
So he would attract young American teenagers, female and male, and just hit at the right time.
Yeah.
It's interesting, really. He was certainly very. Buddy Holly said, and I think others have said, without Elvis Presley, there wouldn't have been anybody. And that might be the case. Certainly in the 50s, it might be the case. But of course, he did very quickly get, if you like, taken over by Colonel Tom Parker. And I think his roots, although he is undoubtedly his early records, That's All Right Mama, Heartbreak Hotel, Jailhouse Rock, Hound Dog, were rock and roll.
Yeah.
And you talked about progressing the music. I don't think Elvis really progressed the music in the way he might have wanted to.
Yeah.
He progressed it because Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, was determined he was going to be an all-round entertainer, which in some ways was the death knell, or the death was death to a developing career. There was all those awful films in the 60s.
Oh, it was dreadful. Yeah.
And but I think in his heart, in his roots, he was absolutely a rock and roller. And he did come back in the late 60s and the early 70s playing the music he really loved, and that he was really, once I think he got a bit more independence. But I think there is something that certainly for white rock and rollers, without Elvis Presley, very few of them could have broken through.
Yeah, very true. Let's now move on to Chuck Berry, who, I think was great. You think was great. Yeah. He had this attitude. I know he went to prison one or two occasions for various, roles, which I think were possibly a little bit contrived by the police.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about that.
So it was a racial thing.
The early ones were.
Yeah.
He very interesting because Chuck Berry came to my attention as part of the 1963 beat boom, which I've already mentioned. I hadn't heard of him before. And I mean, we might talk about the early death of rock and roll and its renaissance in a little while. But when I first learned about him, they'd cut 10 years off his age on all the publicity. He was actually born in 1926.
Yeah.
But all the sleeve notes on his record said 1936. So a bit like Bill Haley, he wasn't a young man when he finally hit the big time. So, and that would have been in 58, 59, when he made fabulous records, but still based on 12-bar blues. You can hear it all the way through. But because he was lucky in as much as, one, he could play the guitar, probably in a way nobody else could, and probably never have been since.
Yeah.
2, he wrote his own songs. And 3, he had a fabulous backing band with Johnny Johnson playing the very well recognized piano.
Yeah.
So those early records were game changers. But interestingly, Tony never had a #1 hit until the Ghastly Song, which we might mention later on.
Yeah, which I understand you were involved with.
Oh, well, yes, to my embarrassment.
No, tell me this. As a guitarist, you're pretty handy. I know that. I've heard you, etc., etc. With Chuck and that little that little finger.
Yeah, that's the one that gets the seventh note on its dum 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 dum.
Yeah.
It's that little finger,
and that made the difference.
That makes a difference. The other thing Chuck Berry had, very big hands, because using that finger to move 2 frets up while keeping the other fingers on the original chord is a big stretch.
Yeah.
And I really struggled to do it. Keith Richards can do it, of course.
Yeah.
And any good guitar, I'm not a good guitarist, but any good guitarist can. But I can do it, but you start to feel it in this finger fairly quickly. But he could do it with his eyes closed. He had big hands. I've seen him. I've seen him many times, and he had big hands. So that was the that was what was called the boogie beat.
Yeah.
So where the note changes on the same chord every second note. So, but I mean, I would say that Chuck Berry invented rock and roll, and if you want to claim king of rock and roll, as they all do, Jerry Lee Lewis, all the others, Little Richard, if there was a king of rock and roll, it'd be Chuck, simply for his innovation, his how original he was, and the great songs he wrote, which were fantastic then,
had stories.
Just in terms in their stories, their stories for their anthems for youth of the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Which of course was, in a way, not many people copied Elvis Presley's rock and roll, because only he could do it in the way he did it. But come the 60s, with the beat boom, they all started their careers playing Chuck Berry.
That's right.
And the Beatles to a bit Little Richard, but mostly it was Chuck Berry.
Yeah.
Robert Verbato and Little Queenie, Johnny B. Good, all of those. They all started their careers, if you like. And I think Chuck Berry was a bit resentful of it, because he hadn't had because of racial prejudice. And you mentioned the many times sometimes he went to prison because of his own behaviour. But I think we forget just how difficult it was for black entertainers in the 50s and the 60s to actually have a fair break. Very often they would be targeted by the authorities, and certainly the one we may mention in a minute in the early 60s was simply a put up job. And of course he was very, very defensive in interviews about his brushes with the law, and he wasn't an easy person. In fact, he was extremely difficult with interviewers and with bands, backing groups.
Hail, rock and roll.
The
movie. It's worth watching. You can see just how stroppy he gets on that.
Indeed. And his tension with Keith Richards in Hail, Rock and Roll, I think, and Eric Clapton, they're all playing together. Is partly to do with the fact he never quite let go of the fact that you are very successful, you are very wealthy people. Because of, if you like,
I created it. And the other thing, of course, he had an ideal view towards commercial activities by demanding the money up front in cash before he'd go on the stage.
He did well, not least because, of course, he had been ripped off so many times. I mentioned
that's right. Back to Freed,
In order to get Sweet Little 16 played, he said he suddenly discovered that Alan Freed was one of the co-writers and had nothing whatsoever to do with it.
No, it was pretty corrupt, wasn't it?
he looked after himself, but for good reason. I've seen him in his late 70s, early 80s, playing in Russia, of all places, before the clampdown like it is now, but in the period of Glasnost. Refusing, standing on stage in front of hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian fans, refusing to play. And the manager or the stage manager coming on and handing money to him. This is actually on stage.
I hope it wasn't
And he'd do
rubles.
that. Yeah, nobody messed with Chuck Berry.
No, and he, you have to admire him for that. Let's move on to Buddy Holly, another success story. On a basic bit of luck, initially.
Yeah, well, Buddy Holly, of course, he came from Texas.
Yeah,
which wasn't
Lubbock.
Which was unlike Nashville, Lubbock, Texas. Yeah. Unlike Nashville and Mississippi and Louisiana, Missouri, those sorts of places where the black rock stars came from, or many of them did. He came from deep down in Texas, where there wasn't probably massive stadium. Not easy to get into recording studios, but I think he is one of the real innovators as well.
Yeah.
I mean, That'll Be the Day, Rave On. Those songs, again, are songs you can still play today. And that doesn't apply to all of the early rock and roll. That still has a freshness. And I think we might have mentioned it years and years ago when we did one of these. Buddy Holly played lead using chords.
Yes.
And I won't try and... He didn't play single notes. If you hear his music, he's actually playing chords. And it's very unusual. I can't play it. Very difficult. So things like... Not Fade Away, and
Peggy Sue.
Peggy Sue's a classic.
Yeah.
Where actually the main melody is being played with chords rather than with notes, and that's amazing.
And it works, doesn't it?
I think, his career was so short because of his tragic death on the 3rd of February 1959. Goodness knows what he might have been. He might have blown up like many others did, but you didn't get that impression that he was. He seemed to be a very well-grounded guy. And I suspect he'd have got back with his friends and fellow collaborators in the Crickets. When he died, they separated. He'd gone to New York. But his post-Buddy Holly and the Crickets music, like True Love Ways and so on, you talked about, that was definitely a progression. It wasn't rock and roll.
No.
But they were good tunes. Yeah.
In the same way that Elvis progressed. Let's go on to another real rocker, Little Richard.
Yeah.
What can you say about him?
I think very extraordinary man, an extraordinary talent. I think, it does stand up there with Chuck Berry. Innovative.
Yeah,
he did write many of his own songs. Suffered terrible prejudice in the early days. I mean, the classic isn't, which you'll know what I'm going to say. He was ripped off so much with Tutti Frutti and Pat Boone covers. Yeah. They are excruciating hearing a white man singing sort of a melody of
a bebop or
Tutti Frutti hold the Rudy, and again how Little Richard coped with that, because he couldn't get airplay. Although his songs were known in the black community, he couldn't get those big hits. But and of course he being gay, he suffered huge prejudice as well. But you may even remember it, but it was an amazing Granada TV program in the 60s of him. And it is the most extraordinary concert I have ever seen. I mean, he sang all of his big hits, and the dynamism was just amazing. You can still get it in black and white. You can pick it up.
Yeah, it's probably on YouTube, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. If you look at Little Richard Granada concert, after that was when he was still sort of playing his music straight. After that, he did get a bit sort of showman-y, and with massive bouffant hair and outrageous costumes. But those songs, Lucille, Tutti Frutti, Good Golly Miss Molly, all the others that don't jump into my mind immediately. Oh, The Girl Can't Help It.
Yeah.
Sally. I mean, those are standards, again, that were picked up by people like the Beatles later on.
Very much so.
And of course, he well, as so many of them were able to later on, were able to make a good living once some of the prejudice went away on the revival shows. And you could often, at Wembley Stadium, you could see Little Richard. Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, a whole host of stars all on the same program. They were amazing in the sort of early 70s.
Yeah, yeah.
But a fantastic talent. And I'm delighted to say, unlike so many of his contemporaries, he lived to a very advanced age.
Yeah.
And I think the product of that, and it would apply to Chuck Berry as well, they were recognised ultimately. Chuck Berry got all sorts of recognition from President Carter and other presidents, and Little Richard was recognised as well. And I think that's great that, although it took a long while, their role was recognised.
Yeah. Now, he was a piano thumper, as was our next one, Jerry Lee Lewis.
Yes. Quite different character, I think.
Yeah.
Called himself the Killer. And again, came from the South. I think probably another, like Chuck Berry, another difficult character.
Yes, very much so.
Had his own share of scandal, but produced some of the most iconic rock and roll tunes, Great Balls of Fire, and others like that. And again, gave him, when he chose to, and usually he did, chose to give amazing stage performances. And again, but I mean, we've dealt with those three, or those five, if you like. If we just talk about Jerry Lee Lewis, but the others as well. Jerry Lee Lewis, of course, had his own massive scandal, which virtually appeared to have finished his career in the late 50s, early 60s, which was about being married to his cousin, who was 13 years old. And that was all discovered when he was on tour in the UK.
But it was legal. It was legal. He wasn't breaking the law in that state.
No, he wasn't breaking the law in the state, but of course it was absolutely.
Yeah.
More than it's certainly in the UK. It's got this, and I mean, in later interviews, particularly with his wife, they obviously divorced at some stage, but she was fine about it. But it was how things were done in those deep southern states, and we rightfully would be outraged. But around the late 50s and the early 60s, all of the people we've talked about had virtually disappeared for one reason or another. Bill Haley had gone. Elvis Presley was in the army. Buddy Holly sadly had died. Chuck Berry was in prison. Little Richard had found religion.
Yeah, that's right.
And was only making gospel. And Jerry Lee Lewis essentially was casted out of darkness because of this scandal. And when we talk about is rock and roll dead, of course, that's when they said rock and roll is dead.
And
in the early 60s, the very early 60s, we had some pretty grotty music.
Oh, dreadful. I remember it. Or I choose not to, probably.
Well, exactly. Your Bobby V.
They were all Bobbies, weren't they?
Take Good Care of My Baby. And you really couldn't hear any original rock and roll music. You were having these ballads being produced, and I think it was probably a generational thing. The managers wanted to turn these people into all-round entertainers.
Yes, driven by money.
And of course they were the people who were running music then. The musicians themselves were really just pawns. They had very little independence. The people who were a generation ahead of them. They were their dads, and they decided how. So it rock and roll was. I mean, there were rock and roll is dead. The ballads of the future, and it took really the beat
boom of the 60s,
Liverpool and Manchester to revive it and actually give it life again.
Can we just talking about this though? I'm not sure whether I class the Everly Brothers as a rock and roll act.
No, me. It's an interesting point.
But having said that,
very talented.
Having said that, they saved Warner Brothers Records, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
I mean, it was bust, and they got one hit. Bust. They got one hit, and that turned the thing completely for the recording company.
Yeah, they did, and they were original in many ways as a
harmonizers,
harmonizing. Good. Well, certainly Don was a very good guitarist. And had a great voice. And again, they came from a very hard mining community in. Well, I would forget which state, but Kentucky, somewhere
Kentucky,
like that.
I think.
Yeah. And but of course, something we haven't talked about is because America is so big and states are so big, there were all these tiny little local radio stations, weren't there? and they got an early break as children, going on singing harmonies together as children. So they learned their music early. They learned how to sing together through country music and the sorts of things they were singing. But it's difficult, that, Tony, because some of their early music had a very definite beat.
Yes.
Wake Up Little Susie, Bird Dog, those sorts of things were very powerfully driven. But of course, then they got into Kathy. I forget the tune.
Cathy's Clown.
Cathy's Clown. That's it. Cathy's Clown. And you couldn't really define that as rock and roll.
No, not at all. It was pop.
Yes, it was pop.
And this is something that I always think, everyone puts a rock and roll label on a whole load of music.
Yeah.
Really, it was pop music. It wasn't rock and roll.
Yes, it was popular. You're quite popular music. Didn't have, for me, did not have that 12-bar beat underneath it. And I think that is key if you look at the roots of rock and roll. And of course, didn't very often include major guitar breaks in the middle of tunes. Most rock and roll has a guitar break in the middle, and very often wouldn't have featured what would be three bass, two guitars, and a drum, which is usually the core of rock and roll.
Standard format.
For rock and roll, we've been talking about anyway.
Yeah.
Sometimes a piano.
Let's pop over to dear old Blighty for a sec, because we sometimes forget Tommy Steele.
Yes,
and he did a couple of rock and roll numbers, didn't he?
Yeah, he didn't really feature very much in my consciousness, other than singing the blues.
Yes,
but it wasn't some. You're gonna have to help me on this. There's something
Rebel rock,
caveman blues or something.
Yeah, rock with the caveman.
Rock with the caveman.
Rock. There were several there. They weren't particularly good, but I suppose he held.
There was nobody else.
That's right.
Without Tommy Steele, there was nobody else in the UK.
Yeah.
It was, we were still got Danny Kaye and those sorts of people.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And at the same time, as we're talking about the mid-50s, 57, something like that, Lonnie Donegan comes on the scene, trad jazz banjo player, suddenly invents skiffle, and a whole load of the stars of the 60s put their success down to Lonnie Donegan.
Yeah, I think Lonnie Donegan does not get the recognition that he deserved. I think he was a real phenomenon for it. He was with the Chris Barber band, wasn't he?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And came from Scotland. Again, like so many of these, wasn't a young man. No. Sadly died far too young through ill health. But some of his, like Rock Island Line is the classic.
Yeah.
But also Good Morning Blues was one of his songs, and Midnight Special. Yeah. All of those have that backbeat and the 12-bar blues. And I mean, they were at least, those three I've mentioned, were at least as powerful in terms of originality and early rock and roll music as, for example, something like Rockin' Round the Clock or That'll Be the Day. I mean, things like Hound Dog, Jailhouse Rock, Johnny Be Good, Good Golly Miss Molly are indisputably heavy rock and roll.
Yeah.
Some of them, some of the others I would define as rock and roll, and also groundbreaking.
Yeah.
And we had, again, other than Tommy Steele and Lonnie Donegan, there was nothing in the 58, 59, 60.
No, not at all.
You were starting to get in this country, Adam Faith, Cliff Richard, those sorts of characters, and they weren't playing rock and roll. They were playing popular music, as you said.
Yeah.
2 minutes, in Adam Faith's case, 1 minute and 45 seconds tune.
Yeah.
Which had nothing to do with rock and roll.
The interesting.
I think Lonnie Donegan was an amazing talent, and again, I think he did have quite a long career. He there was another one which I don't know whether you call it rock and roll, but it had an amazing beat, which was Pick a Bed of Cotton. So again, he's picking blues music up from the
deep south. Yeah. But I thought what really impressed me with Lonnie Donegan is you could make a trio up out of somebody with a cheap guitar, somebody with a washboard doing the percussion, and somebody with, I don't know whether people will remember these, a T-chest bass, which was a T-chest upside down with a broom handle.
Yep.
one string. I
Yes.
mean, you know, that's what
That is a
started it.
really good point.
Yeah,
If we're thinking about why rock and roll happened
yeah,
and whether or not it's dead now,
yeah.
it was the ease of making music. I mean, as you know, I've got too many guitars and too many amplifiers
Well,
and
you
so
did
on.
sell two,
I have, yes,
so you're
starting to
down,
thin them out
down
a
to
bit,
down into the teens.
but you know, our generation and you can afford to buy this equipment, but they couldn't,
No,
whether it's in the States or here. So particularly black musicians, they'd pick a very battered old guitar up, they'd rewire it, perhaps not, they'd learn how to actually tune it into some semblance of tune. Just the same over here.
yeah, yeah,
T-chest, a washboard with thimbles on,
yeah,
and a very cheap old guitar, because you couldn't actually import guitars, even if you could afford them. Good American guitars you
yeah,
couldn't
yeah,
import
yeah,
them.
yeah.
And I think this ability, Buddy Holly's another one, of three or four pals coming together and wanting to make music and being able to make a form of music with very basic equipment also goes to the heart of the birth of rock and roll,
Yeah.
and perhaps why it's not there anymore, because there isn't the ability for three or four lads or girls to come together and innovate with the most basic musical instruments and then get a break.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah.
You can't get it's all so expensive now and so costly to break into the music industry.
And no support from the record industry as such.
No, there isn't.
You don't get signed up like you used to do.
No, and promoted.
So let's have a look at the count here, because, you know, just to sort of make the point, Beatles 2 out of 4 dead, Rolling
Yeah,
Stones 2 out of 5 dead,
yeah,
Cream 2 out of 3 dead.
yeah.
You know, they're all getting on. I'm getting on.
We
Even
all
you are.
are.
Even you are.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
you know, this is the point of this particular chat. The fact that really it's dying because all of those early performers are dead.
Those early innovators. I think there is something interesting. Just taking the Rolling Stones. I don't know if you've ever heard the LP that was made in Madison Square Gardens by them back in the late 60s, called Get Your Yah-Yahs Out.
Mm-hmm.
And the introduction says, the greatest rock and roll band in the world, the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones. They were, so, yeah, I mean, I suppose it applies to almost any type of music. Big bands disappeared, didn't they? Because the band leaders died, and, you know, with the passage of time. I think it is. I think it's also that, for the reasons that we've been discussing earlier, that there isn't the opportunity for young people to make music in the way they used to. And of course, electronics have become so much more sophisticated. You can essentially make music. Goodness knows what AI will do to music. You can make music without having any musical ability. So whereas in my day and our day, most young men wanted to buy a guitar and become a rock star. And so many people started, you know, and then chucked the guitar away because they got interested in other things. I don't think there is that inclination. But I think, for me, Tony, some of those, although sadly so many of the innovators have passed away, you can't take away the music.
No.
And that's still there.
Yeah.
And I suppose if you say rock and roll is dying because nobody's making new rock and roll tunes using if you accept the formula I've had, 12-bar blues from the blues and the country influence, nonetheless, you go to any sort of wedding, after wedding party, or go to a party, you can play modern music, but put Chuck Berry, Johnny B. Good on, and most people get up to
dance.
They're
up and dancing.
If they don't get up to dance, they won't be able to stop their feet tapping.
So to conclude, I put a point down: who continues to carry the baton? Well, the baton is basically carried by the dead people that have been recorded.
I think that's the case. I mean, classical musicians would think what I'm about to say is sacrilege, but and it probably is in terms of, you know, serious music, if you want to call that music serious music. But yeah, Beethoven still played Tchaikovsky as Mozart, and it's wonderful, and it's reinterpreted by great orchestras and great conductors. For myself, in terms of popular music, and rock and roll is popular music, I think that in 100 years' time, this music will still be played, and some people will still try to interpret it. It's not a it's not a group of work as big as the great classical composers.
No.
But it's and of course, if we talk about how many classical composers now exist who stand alongside Beethoven and Tchaikovsky and Mozart and Schubert, clearly there is still classical music being made. But you go into the record shops don't exist now, but when they did, most of that music goes back to the 17th, 18th century.
Yeah,
so I'm not pessimistic. I don't think we'll see, for all the socioeconomic reasons we discussed, a great boom of young people wanting to make their own music and creating from scratch new music, new rock and roll music. But I think there will still be people interested in playing. The other thing that perhaps we might want to accept is that in my day, my mum and dad's music was an anathema to me. Didn't want to know about it.
Oh yeah, me too. Glenn Miller. Ooh.
Yeah, but my children and my grandchild like the music, still refer back, have their own music, but refer back to the music that I enjoyed and still play it.
Yeah, and this is true with me as well. This is true with me as well.
So I think we're unlikely to see any great innovators like the ones we've discussed.
No.
But I suspect there'll be reinterpretation of that amazing music, which won't ever die. Actually, Johnny Be Good can't ever die because it's on the Voyager outside of our solar system, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's on that disk, which is going to welcome an alien in about 2 million years, 3 million years time. And the one bit of contemporary music is on there is Johnny Be Good. So I wonder what they'll think when they start to play that.
Richard, we've run out of time.
Oh, sorry.
As ever. No, don't apologise. It's been a great pleasure. Good to see you, mate.
Good to see you.
And keep in touch, and many
Absolutely.
thanks. All the best.
Great
Bye-bye.
pleasure. Bye-bye, Tony. Bye.